I'm going to hit record. Awesome. So my name is Hema Saring-Saminsky. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Jane Doe Inc., JDI, the Massachusetts Coalition. And I am so excited to be here with some beloved friends and colleagues in the movement and field. We have with us Sherry Tadoko and Judy Chen from the Washington State Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And we're really, I'm going to there's so much I could say about these two human beings. Um, Part of how we came to do this work together and to bring this offering to you all today was really from several conversations about, really looking at the impact of our funding models, our work on this brilliant workforce of so many folks who are survivors who have and continue to experience so many intersecting forms of oppression. And we do this work and we run these programs and we put our hearts and souls and bodies into making the work sustainable to the extent that we can. And as we look at all of that, we run into some barriers over and over again. And sometimes those barriers are related to our structures, our funding models itself. So, in some conversations with Sherry and Judy, they said at some point, hey, we're doing this cool thing in Washington State. And we're actually answering that question that I think so many of us have had, which is, why are we being asked to do so much, sometimes on so little, or sometimes without funding at all? Right. And so I think there's some of those questions that I think we have been grappling with as a state right now, facing some budget cuts from our own state, thinking about the many, many requirements we're sometimes forced to jump through to stay in compliance with our funding. Um, and the reality that people are tired, people are burnt out, and we want to really, really think about how we keep this work sustainable for not just this year, not the next 2 years, but for generations to come, right? To the extent that we can be well and thriving and create the communities we want for ourselves and survivors. So I'm really just going to stop there and let Sherry and Judy introduce themselves and get started sharing this wisdom. Um, just so you know, Sherry and Judy, on this call today are a lot of folks who've been working pretty closely with some strategizing about our own uh, challenges here in Massachusetts about funding, some who are newer to the conversation and just learning, and others who are ready to, others who've been making the case for honestly, probably decades that the funding models don't match what it actually takes to run services. Um, so welcome and thanks everybody for joining us. And I'll turn it over to you both. I don't know who wants to kick off.
I can introduce myself and then turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Sherry Tinoco. Hi, Judy Chen from the Washington State Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We are a new sexual assault coalition and an old domestic violence coalition. I've been at the coalition for about 20, 25 years and have been had the good fortune of working with so many domestic violence, sexual assault, shelter programs, tribal programs, and culturally specific programs. And I come from working in the community in Asian and Pacific Islander and LGBTQ anti-violence work, and vividly remember my first year as a director saying we needed 11 by the end of the year to make payroll, and just how stressful that was, and how small that budget was back in the day, and really questioning why is the funding model the way that it is. My hope for this time together is that that you won't feel that we'll be able to feel less bad, that you'll feel like, hey, it's not me. and it's not my coworkers. And there's something bigger going on here. And we want to kind of pull back the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, and say what's really going on here, because we cannot work our way out of this by just working harder. So Sherry has some great insights to share with us, and turning it over to Sherry.
Thank you, Judy. Hello, everyone. Sherry Tinoco, she, her, they pronouns. And just a little bit of background about myself. I've been with the Washington State Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence for just under a year now. And I really started off with the coalition doing what we were calling cost analysis work, of really leaning in to looking at what is the actual cost to provide services compared to the funding and the requirements for the funding. And over the year, I've just really been blessed and honored to work with WSCDIV and our member programs in Washington in a lot of really robust conversations around those things. Prior to coming to WSCDIV, I worked for 20 years in a victim services program, so domestic violence, sexual assault, and crime victims. And I served as executive director in the program for 13 years, and then as development director for the remaining time. So I was very familiar with the dynamics that were happening in the field, not only in our organization, but peer organizations where I was constantly seeing people coming in with passion and energy, trying to make victim services work, and then getting chewed up and spit out of this, exhausting, revolving hamster wheel system that we were in. And it came to the point where I just really was like, hard pause, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how did we get here? And that was kind of the birth of this project. Um, a few caveats before I start the presentation. One, I'm a nerd, so I'll get really excited and just go on and on and on. Judy is going to keep an eye on the chat and make me stop at points when people have questions. So while, and apologies in advance, I will talk a lot. I love interaction. I really want to be helpful in answering questions. So please, if you have anything that you want to ask about that doesn't make sense or that you're curious, drop it in the chat, and then we'll make sure, or Judy will make sure that we have space to lean into that. Second, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll just be upfront. It is probably breaks all of the rules around PowerPoint presentations. It has no pictures. It's just boring, and it's not word for word, but pretty close. And a couple reasons did it on purpose, broke all the rules on purpose, but mainly so that it can be a usable tool for people after the presentation. So you don't have to worry about taking notes. The PowerPoint will actually be a printable document or something that you could cut and paste pieces out if there's any of it that sparks your curiosity and you want to work with more. I think those are my caveats. So,
Hey, Sherry, I'm just remembering that you wanted me to do a little intro. Would you like me to do that now, or do you want to plunge in?
sure. How about go ahead and I'll see if I can get this screen share.
Great. All right. So Sherry had asked me if I would say a little bit about how this project came about. So, I think pretty much in every state and territory, we're all trying to figure out and struggling really hard with the plummeting amounts that are in in the VOCA pot, about how we're going to keep services funded for survivors. And what has become clear is that, policymakers and legislators want to know the answer to that too. And, we were seeing uh, a sense among some policymakers of if we could just shuffle the money around and also from some domestic violence and sexual assault programs. The rural programs saying, well, the urban programs have so much in their community and so much wealth. How about we need more. The urban programs saying we have these huge population centers and we're turning away, you know, dozens of survivors for every person that we're able to serve, which is not always what happens in rural areas. So we need more money. The culturally specific programs saying, hey, we don't get any of the formula funds or, the level of money that the mainstream programs have. And the mainstream programs saying, hey, especially those that are running emergency shelter, running an emergency shelter is like taking a pile of money, putting it in your backyard and setting it on fire every year, right? It's a bottomless pit. So, in the sexual assault program saying, hey, what about us, right? So, when legislators have in our state expressed a strong interest, and they said they wanted to see what the victim services model and funding really needs to look like. And that gave an opportunity to do a dive into saying, hey, let's get on the balcony and look higher, look down, 10,000-foot view, what's really going on? And we were able to see, and I think that everyone who served on that committee was able to see eventually, the pie is so small, there's no shuffling around that will make it work. And then the pie is actually too small to even provide the services, even a speck of the services that we're actually required to do. And then Sherry had some really great insights about why are there all these mandates that are actually unfunded mandates for us in the field. And I want to say that these unfunded mandates are not things that survivors don't deserve. They do deserve them. They deserve all of the help and support, safety, independence, justice. But is this happening on the backs of advocates who are often survivors themselves? Um, and on the backs of domestic violence and sexual assault programs that don't have the money to do the work that they're required to do and that survivors in the community desperately need. So that put us on a journey of saying what's really going on. And of course, that's what survivor advocacy is all about, right? Is to say what's really going on here beyond the individual level. What's happening that's systemic and that's societal. So, Sherry and I, both, and like many of you have been directors, so we know that money is what was one of the resources we need. It's not the only one, but it's one of the resources. So that's what we're going to talk about here. But another resource that we're going to be talking about is support from the public, from communities, political goodwill, other kinds of support besides just financial. All right, Sherry, did I check all the boxes there? Okay, back to you. Yep, it's up. There you go. And you're muted.
There we go. No wonder I was asking if anyone could see the slides to do a thumbs up, and no one responded, but that makes sense. No one could hear what I was saying. Okay, so we're tackling this like the real cost of victim services. As Judy mentioned, there's the money element, but then there's also a lot of dynamics that we have inherited since the beginning of the domestic violence, sexual assault victim services movement, from the time that it started to then when funding came into the picture. And a little bit of background on the funding dilemma just from Washington State, so that you have something to compare, like what might be relevant or not for your state. Washington State's been facing major shortfalls in funding for the past, I think it's 6 years now, 6 years that we've needed to go in front of the state legislature and ask for supplemental funding to offset the VOCA cuts that have been happening in our state. And that's also paired with our state, like so many, are facing budget deficits themselves. Each year, the state budget deficit has gotten worse. This year, same thing. It's worse. But what they're telling us now is that there's a $7-8 billion deficit for the upcoming state year that needs to be mitigated. And they had cut over $10 million of services last year. So our programs are still, it's about a 40% gap from what VOCA funding used to provide that the state has covered. And now we're really looking at the strong possibility that the state will not be able to supplement and fill that gap. So it's a major, major crisis. What that's resulted in, programs across our state have been struggling for years to balance their own budgets and to do that in a way that's meeting the mandates that funders have, as well as the specific needs of survivors in their communities, which may or may not align with the mandates that are provided by the funders. And then we have a system dilemma. The VOCA cuts have highlighted the funding issue, but it also has made it clear to us that that is not the primary issue. There's a larger issue at hand. The funding model that is being used for victim services has been set up in a charity model versus a social services model. And I'll talk a little bit more about those definitions, but it's an important distinction to keep in mind as we kind of follow the pathway of how did we end up in the way that the systems are today. And that's primarily because it's using a charity model to fund a social services program. What that results in for our programs is that the amount of funding that's provided to do services does not equal the actual cost for providing services. Judy touched on this a little bit, but the current funding model in Washington and what so many times was brought back to member programs or programs providing services is that there's this concept of a pie, and that the pie represented the total amount of funding that Washington State had to provide to programs. And the conversation always centered around, should we split this pie in a different way? If we give 2% more to sexual assault victim services, is that going to solve the problem? We can take 2% from crime victims. But it's that model, each time that conversation happened, it became more clear to me that, one, the funding is not a pie. And in order to determine how much funding a particular program needs, we need to know how much that program costs. What does that actually cost to provide that service? And the other part of the way that our funding is structured, in order for it to not be competitive, to be non-competitive funds, then the programs like domestic violence shelters or sexual assault crisis centers, they have to agree to provide a full scope of mandated services in order to be eligible for those funds. And then in our state, at least, since the 1980s, early 1990s, as funding was coming in, the structure for what's required for domestic violence and sexual assault programs has remained relatively the same, at least in the core structure of emergency shelter, 24/7 hotline, 24/7 in-person response, whether it be to shelter or to a hospital for sexual assault. And as we were doing this, we lifted up, like what are the problems with that model? When funders are not using cost data to make sure that what's being mandated has an equal sign between the mandate and the amount of money that's allocated, then funding decisions are being made without a solid financial analysis, which harkens back to charity model. For programs, what does that mean? What is the problem? That the actual cost to meet the mandates for the funding exceeds the dollar amount that's in the funding contract. And then we'll just hold this thread throughout, that lifting up that costs that are not funded do not disappear, right? And I know for me, when I worked at a program as a director, I never questioned. It was like, this is the system, this is the way that it works, this is the way that it's always been. It's my job to figure it out. And there was like this clear light bulb moment for me around like, just because something isn't being paid for with money doesn't mean that that cost goes away. So how do we follow? Where is that cost being paid ultimately? Some framing that we did for our state, because we were leaning into conversations, are leaning into conversations with funders, with program directors, with other coalitions. Like there's some important pieces to keep in mind. Everyone that is doing this work at whichever level or discipline within the work, we've all inherited the current system. Right. So for funders, we don't want to approach this with frustration and anger for funders. They inherited the system. For program directors, same thing. Like all of us are doing the best that we can within a system that was created well before we entered in to the process ourselves. Also, the system itself has continued to roll along relatively unchanged. And keeping in mind the vast differences of the last 50 years of the realities around people's needs, survivors' needs, what technology exists today that can change ways that people could access services. So many fundamental changes, even me doing this today, you know, on this platform for people across the nation, like that wasn't even a thing of dreams 50 years ago. And then there's the saying around like two sides of the same coin, really like lifting up that the funding being done in a charity model where you give a little bit of money for a product or an output that actually is a social service. Those are two sides of different coins. And so like leaning into that conversation and clarifying like how abnormal our system actually is, and I always like to say like it's so easy for people if we're doing something abnormal, how easy it can become to think that that is normal at some point in time. And it's always important to like lift that back up that no, it's not normal just because we're doing it or we've been doing it for 50 plus years still doesn't make it normal. So little bit about like what is a charity model? If you look online, the model, oftentimes those are food banks, clothing resource, school supplies, like efforts that it's a good cause. That's the orientation. Here's something that's like, it's going to be a good thing. It's primarily grounded in volunteerism, that people that are doing the work are going to do so of their own free time because they care about the cause. The funding for charities generally come from events or activities, performances, maybe some one-time short-term grants that are specific to that purpose. And charity work or charity projects are generally short-term, one-time, and the expectations are very project specific. So if I was operating a charity to school supplies for a school, I might do that every year, but that focus is very specific to, beginning of the school year. On the other coin, what we actually do is social services. And a social services model is that it's oriented towards an essential service. This is something that needs to happen every day, year round, for the foreseeable future, as long as the core central issue exists. Some examples of that are like disability services, veteran services, behavioral health services. Those are all peer system models in our community, and their funding behaves in a very different way than the funding for victim services. Generally, those kinds of systems are set up on fee-for-service. I'll just pause. I am not advocating for a fee-for-service model. People can have a lot of feelings around that. It's simply illustrating how how the funding behaves differently between charity funding mindset and a social services model. What the fee for service does is it puts that equal sign, right? Like you do X, you get this amount of money. And that continues on a regular basis. Those type of funding models generally have a match requirement because it's government funding, and that's up to 20%, not exceeding 20%. And then it's ongoing and continuous, and the funding is based on the outputs and compliance. So we can see that, I mean, I guess that one of the questions that came up for us is what we are doing. Are victim services a charity model? Or is it a social services model? And if it is the latter, how do we go about introducing an equal sign between the amount of funding that's available, the mandates that are required to receive the funding, and have an equal sign between the amount of money provided? Just wanted to check, Judy, if we've got any questions.
There's nothing in the chat so far, but folks, do you have questions, comments, disagreement? You could give a thumbs up if this is resonating with you. Oh, thank you, Nance. Thank you, Sherry G. Thank you, Susan. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Christina. Thanks for helping us see that it's weird sometimes we can't see people. Divya, thanks, Divya. Thanks, Koru.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And Sherry, I just want to appreciate so much how you're saying that that we have these mandates, that other systems have mandates too, but what's up that they are not in the same kind of crisis that we are? Oh, thanks, Kelly.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. And I can't see the Zoom room with my two screen issues. So I appreciate you, Judy, letting me know. So I'll carry on and get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes. In looking at this system, the system of services that was created by trailblazers before us at a time when there were no services. The issues of domestic violence and sexual assault were not seen as real, valid, important issues that needed to be addressed. Honoring that they created systems in a time when there was nothing and there was no support for doing anything when it came to, at the time, battered women and the needs of battered women. But when we look at the model today and how it's remained relatively the same, it's important to look at we leaned into what were the barriers and challenges that survivors faced, in the 70s and in the 80s, when the services were formed in a charity model on purpose because they had to. There was no one that was going to pay for it. The only way that the services could start was by volunteers who were passionate about the issue, who were going to show up anytime, middle of the night, and not be paid because it needed to happen. And then as time progressed, money, let's see, there we go. Money came into the picture. The system didn't change all that much, but the world around us has, so what are the realities that have changed over time? And then now that we are not in the same situation where we're fighting to have the issue recognized and having to do it from a volunteer, truly grassroots way, looking at it today, really leaning into curiosity, what are the real costs and the real impacts of continuing to use an outdated model? Because as mentioned before, simply because a cost isn't paid for by money doesn't mean that the impact of that cost goes away. And then are we essential service or are we charity? So Whiskative leaned into those curiosities, and we started doing some work with our member programs to collect data. And we did that via some small focus groups. We had a series of gatherings with a select few programs that would be comfortable in really leaning into their actual budget costs and being able to share those with us. And then we did several surveys out to the field to capture information about what the impacts of cuts would be on the service delivery if the state supplemental funds did not come through. We did surveys to assess what the impacts of 24/7 services are on staff that are doing the work. And then we did some dreaming with some programs of what if they could, what changes would they make to their victim service delivery systems within their own communities. So one of the first surveys we did, kind of dual purpose. One was to communicate to legislators of what would happen if funding for programs was suddenly cut by 40%. But we also wanted to see from directors themselves, what if they envisioned that happening, what would they do? And 80% of directors said that they would be forced to reduce the scope and the volume of direct services to their organization. That seemed like that made sense. It was a little surprising though that 20% indicated that their services would stay the same, and that really, this is a rabbit trail, so I won't go down it too far, but it's really was indicative to me of how the passion to make sure the work happens runs strong, that it can be really hard to actually, even at a program level, tie the costs to the money. 77% of directors said, if the funding cuts happen, they'd have to cut their services. So 77% said they would try and find more money, more temporary one-time money to continue to try and offset the cuts in order to maintain the services that existed. And then kind of that flip side that I touched on, 20% said, we're not going to change. We're going to keep doing the same thing no matter how much money we have. The next survey that we did with that group in particular, saying, if you were given the opportunity, if funders said, okay, the mandates are now a buffet menu option, that you could do this and or that and or the other, what would programs do? 6% said they would stay the same. They would continue to operate business as usual under the current existing structure. 56% said they would want to modernize or change the pattern of services and the delivery model that they offered at their organization. And then 38% said they weren't sure. So this was kind of a litmus test for us of just the field, of readiness of directors, and no right or wrong in readiness, but just how were people thinking of the system that they were operating within, if they had the opportunity to change, would they want to? And this led us to really prioritizing that our, from a coalition level, we don't have an agenda on what programs should do. Our agenda, if there is one, is that we want programs to have choice. Some programs want to do 24/7 services. We think that they should be able to choose that. Other programs don't. And we think they should be able to choose that. So really keeping our central focus that we're not, there might not be, and if there is, we are not the experts in saying what is the model that should exist, other than allowing kind of free will and autonomy at each program level to make that determination for their own communities. The second set of data that we pulled was getting actual budget number from a small group of victim services. And the programs that were part of that group, they were either a domestic violence shelter with a 24/7 hotline, an SA program with the same, or they were a dual agency. And we looked at the amount of funding that they got from the state versus what the actual costs were. And then we did a different method that was much more simplistic. It leaves out a ton of other costing information, but it still gets to at least a number that associates an output to a cost of providing that output. I have tools for both of those models. If anyone is interested in having a copy of those, either to see it or to play around with it, I'm happy to share those. I've shared with other states. So the tools, because they are quite the headache to look at. But they're Excel spreadsheets that it's all formulated, easy to use overall. Domestic violence advocacy hours that were provided. We can pull cost data to speak to those 2 points that are clear, they're already accepted, or they've already been determined by either federal or state government. So the 2 points that we pulled for that, for bed nights, we use the federal veteran per diem shelter rate for bed nights. That's already been determined by the federal government as a valid number to quantify how much a shelter night is worth. And then we use the living wage report from Washington State to do advocacy hour valuing. We started with a premise in doing this that we believe, so the foundation when we do our math, we need to hold that people doing victim services work need to have access to a livable wage with benefits and PTO. So we did not cost out a model where there's this magic combination of part-time people that cover all of the services is what that means. So living wage determination, I won't go into this too much, but there's a living wage document that Washington State has already created and accepted as being valid. We pulled actual job postings for similar types of work, and then we use state funded state over where the state is employing the position that has a similar scope of work for advocates. So we were looking at a variety of different costing methods. What we landed on was from the living wage, and it's an average that calculates out $24.50. We add in value of payroll tax and benefits, get $32, and then this is the annual amount. At the time that we did the costing, the federal per diem was $68.65. That has since increased, but I didn't change all the numbers for this presentation. So this is from 2023 numbers. When we apply those, Washington State 2023, we had 234,614 nights of shelter that was provided and 101,211 hours of advocacy. Applying the 2 data points that I just shared, the total cost for just those 2 things comes out to $36.7 million. That doesn't include regular daytime advocacy, children's services, therapy, support groups, anything else is not included. No buildings, no telephones, no admin, nothing. So that simple costing gives 2 data points, applies federal or state accepted cost values. We can see that the funding provided by the state is $16 million. And the actual cost for just those 2 things, which are mandates for all programs, is $36.7 million. So that shows a disparity, that no equal sign between just those 2 data points. We, for sexual assault programs, the approach that we took is just the 24/7. Sexual assault programs don't have a shelter. If we take the staffing cost, hold in the premise of living wage with access to benefits and paid time off, then the 24/7 staffing cost per program is $290,415. The average award that's given to a sexual assault program in Washington State is $140,000. So again, no other costs involved, but just to meet the mandate to receive the funds of 24/7 services, a program basically is being required to provide a match of 73% of the funding amount, right? Like it's just, and it's not including anything else besides you will have somebody available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The third approach we did was asking programs to provide us with their actual data, for everything. So now we're talking about the building and the phone and the food and the transportation, all of the things that domestic violence programs have to pay for. And we asked them whether their hotline coverage, so the 24/7 requirement, if that was being met by using a stipend to pay for advocate time, or if advocates were being compensated hourly for that work. And then we asked them for their specific award amount. What we found when we captured all of that data for domestic violence shelter programs, that the amount of funding that the state was providing for the mandated services only covered 32% of the actual cost. So that means programs were needing to find and raise, got to do math real quick, 68% of the remaining funding just to meet the mandates for that funding. Which brings us to hidden costs. Probably my squeaky wheel thing is that just because something isn't being paid for doesn't mean the cost goes away. 74% of the programs that were surveyed reported they used the stipend method to pay advocates for after hours call. And most of those stipends were like $50 for a night or $100 for a weekend. There were different models, but it would be a lump sum for then, a 12-hour period of time where the staff person would be available to answer the phone or respond to the shelter or the hospital. When we incorporated that cost, so the unpaid value of after hours time that staff were carrying, that I'm using that same costing points. That was a value, an in-kind unpaid value of $2.8 million that was being offset by the program staff themselves. When we incorporate that in, the state then, if we put that real cost back in as dollars, then the state is only funding 29.63% of the actual cost to the actual cost of the mandates that they're requiring. From there, we leaned into, okay, so the mandates for 24/7, they're not being paid for by dollars at the state level. Programs are then having to raise money or figure out how to make that system work, like on the ground. And for many programs, that is by paying a stipend for the hours that they don't have money to pay somebody a regular living wage to do it. So we did a survey out to the field for advocates, for managers and directors, and we paired it with our regular wage and benefits survey. We added a wellness component, and we asked about on-call impacts so that we could capture, quantify in some way the burden of the unfunded mandates that are falling on advocacy program staff who are not being compensated an hourly wage for their time. In that survey, 64% of staff reported that they were required to be on call in addition to their regular full-time hours. And of those, 81% reported that being on call had a negative impact on their wellness. So that, while subjective, in terms of people self-reporting, it's still a pretty powerful thing. The vast majority of individuals who are on call reported, 81% reported that that was harmful for them in some way. Some other data that we pulled from that report was like the scope of on call, right? Because we might think, well, if I'm on call one night a month, that's going to have a different impact than if I'm on call every night of the week or whatnot. So we wanted to get a sense of the scope. So first we asked, based on position, how many people that responded to the survey are required to be on call? And that was 63% of advocates, 73% of managers, and 70% of directors reported that they're on call. Then we pulled in a subset of how many hours, but in this one in particular, so people who responded that they are on call in addition to their regular full-time hours over 100 hours per month, 57% of advocates, 55% of managers, and 33% of directors reported that they are working regular full-time hours and then being on call over 100 hours in addition every single month. And that's where we see, where did those real costs that weren't funded, where did they go, right? They're going to the staff themselves. That's where the payment is being collected. And that brings us to slippage. It's normal, right? When we talk about like an abnormal, we can somehow think it's normal. But normal, if I want a service or a product, I'm going to be expected to pay for it. If I want a massage, I'm going to have to pay full price for that massage. I won't be able to pay 30% for the massage and then ask the masseuse to fund the remainder in some other way. And we have a model, again, that's inherited. It's not a critique on the people working within the funding system themselves, but funders are buying and requiring services from programs that they do not pay for. So like calling out, that's not normal. The cost of that responsibility is slipping down then to the program level where directors are attempting to fill that gap with fundraising, cobbling together of grants, and so forth. And then when that's not able to work, if there is still a gap, the cost is then slipping down to the direct service level via in-kind labor. And for us, really, the goal is to return that responsibility back up to the purchaser level, right? And in doing that, we return choice down to the program level. And a little bit like that's like a powerful piece for me, particularly when I was in a director position, right? The mandated services that the state requires imposes financial obligations to programs that reduces the ability of a program to make choices around what they will do beyond the grant itself, right? And that's like, if the slippage was returned back up to where funders could only mandate what they can afford to buy, then that 68% of funding that programs are gathering through grants and fundraising, they could then choose autonomously what would they provide with those funds instead of having to obligate those funds to that funder's system. And then the other piece too, like I for 14 years as an executive director, I just repeated the inherited system without thinking about it at all. And how do we move from like replicating, just doing what's always been done, moving towards like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it on purpose. And so like if I was still in a director role, I would have to say, okay, well, I know that the cost of 24/7, we don't have the money to pay for it. And I know that my staff are going to carry the price of 1%, so that is causing them harm. If I choose to do that again, then I need to choose it on purpose, right? Like I need to own that slippage point of like that's within my sphere and say like, okay, yep, we're going to do that. Or, you know, for me, if I was in that director, like that's gonna, it's a whole different frame. I'm gonna push back on that. Like I'm not gonna purposefully choose to perpetuate something that's harmful, right? Like I'm either gonna push that slippage back up, or I'm gonna figure out how do we do this in a different way. The next point of curiosity that we leaned into was like, okay, so we're mandated for 24/7 services. What other programs does the state do that for, right? Like mandating for 24/7, that's a pretty big deal. And did some research, and there are three other disciplines in the state of Washington that have a 24/7 service mandate. That's 911, which is the emergency line for law enforcement and emergency services, 988, which is a suicide and substance abuse prevention hotline that operates 24/7, and then some crisis mental health and detox systems. So three other disciplines that are written in statute required to provide 24/7 services. So it's like, okay, well, we've got something to look at. So let's look at how they're funded. For 911, there's 48.76 million per year from the state, plus county dollars, plus local dollars. And that, you know, provides services in multiple counties and cities across the state. 988, the centralized suicide prevention hotline, has a designated funding stream that brings in $15 million per year. And that 15 million funds three call centers. So roughly $5 million per center. I'll pause for a moment and just for directors that are out there, imagine if you got $5 million. What could you do? Right. And then mental health crisis, there's 6 programs that the state pays $47.4 million per year. And then we have DV and SA programs. For shelters, there's 39 shelters. Each of them is required independently to have a 24/7 hotline. Sexual assault programs, 35, each of them required to have a 24/7 hotline. And then the dollar amount for funding, $16 million that does not have a designated funding stream. And for SA, 6.1 million with no designated funding stream. So we can see pretty clearly that money is behaving in a very different way at the state level for a mandated 24/7 service model. One system, it's being paid for. The other system, it's being required. It's being required, and there's a pretty stark and shocking clear picture that it's that there's no money that can match that requirement.
Hey, Sherry.
Yes.
I wanted to just say we have a comment from Kelly saying brilliant analysis. We all know and live this, but somehow having it stated this way is so powerful. And Hema has said, I think even in a state like Massachusetts, where we do receive more state funding, the ratio is so striking, and that you'd probably find the same thing here. I hope, as so I'll pause there and keep going, Sherry. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I'm almost done with this. Just a little more content, and then we'll just open it up. I'll get rid of the slides, and we can do more conversation. So kind of like the closing thoughts or questions, it's what we've been pondering here in Washington State for the last couple of years. It's what we're continuing to lean into. What are the changes that can be made so that funding equals the cost of mandates, or at least offers choice so that programs themselves can then take that, instead of slippage, there's purposeful choice at the program level that for this amount of money, these are the services that we're going to provide. And then how do we support funders, ourselves, other program leaders, to make their programmatic decisions on purpose, rather than just replicating historical practice, particularly when we can see, the harm that is coming through on those. Sorry, let me stop sharing here. Yeah, if I'm able to stop sharing. There we go. Okay, are we now not sharing?
Yep, good job.
Okay.
Hema, could you put me back on the screen, please?
I will do that.
And Greta says program decisions should be made on purpose.
Yeah.
So, did anyone have their minds blown here?
I feel like the back channel chats are blowing up, you guys. This is really brilliant. And I want to, Greta, put yourself on here too if you want to. Just who's been co-holding this effort for, as we try to hold and analyze as our state is about to enter a new 10-year reprocurement of some of these funding models. Right now our effort is really to try to influence what those processes are going to look like. And to what I've mentioned in the chat, each year as our programs are negotiating we have this rate system called Chapter 257, as we're negotiating those rates. I mean, I just am looking at the list of names here and I'm struck by, I think about John's analysis and Kelly, like so many people here, who have cried these similar points for many, many years. And I appreciate it all being put together. But I will stop talking and let others jump in.
So we have some comments here. Nani Sajiv says this is really helpful information perspective, thinking about how this trickles down to advocates, survivors' well-being. Exactly. Exactly. And we'll circle back to that. And then Kathy says, random related question, wondering for SA agencies, sexual assault agencies that have partnerships with universities to satisfy the mandates, are they receiving any funding from colleges? And if so, what kinds of dollars are being paid to satisfy this? Yeah, great question. Um, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Kathy, I don't know if that was a question to your colleagues. That's not a question we've looked into in our state. But I want to go back to something that we talked about at the beginning, which is like feeling bad, right? And then something that Hema said about why is it that we keep saying these things to legislators and it's like Teflon, it just bounces right off of them. Like it doesn't seem to penetrate, you know? It feels like we're saying things, but nobody's listening. So I want to say it is the case that we have as long as our movement and our field has the message that we can fix this with what one of our rural program directors says with duct tape and chicken wire, that we'll just keep making what people in the community and legislators are people in the community, what they hear then from us is we'll take it. It doesn't matter. Well, that are life-saving um, and mandatory and also state mandated, uh, and that it's fine. And so we have to find a way to change the framework and the story of what we're saying. And I think that one framework that we're trying out in this state is saying the services actually are only being paid 30 cents on the dollar, and there's not enough money to fund the services that people in the community believe will always be there for themselves or their neighbors or their family members. That actually there's not enough money to pay for it, and so the services actually will be either reduced or go away. And that's a different message than lawmakers have heard from us before. They have not, and like one of the things that we realized is, sometimes when we have a message and then that message changes and we say, actually, we're closing services, what people, it's so shocking to them that it's a normal human reaction to say, that can't be true or you're lying. Does that make sense? It can't be true. How can that be? Why didn't you tell me before? How is this happening? And so we've realized that we've had to kind of um, bring them into the conversation. And it's taken like 2 years to do that into the conversation of actually the money that you think is there to provide these services is not. And the whole thing is beginning to, it's the duck and chicken wire is beginning to crumble. That's a mixed metaphor, but I hope you get what I mean. So that has been like that has helped shift the conversation. The second thing is that I want to just acknowledge, I think many of us are directors or managers or have been of direct services, is that it's one thing to kind of know, like it's one thing to know like there's not enough money to keep things going the way that they are. It's another thing to have to say to people, we're not going to be answering the phone. We're going to be turning more people away. We can't, we might have to close, one director in our state said, we might have to close all of our legal services or shut down the emergency shelter. It's one or the other. It's a terrible feeling when you have people calling and saying like, somebody's going to kill me and please let me in. And so it's unfair that we are put in the position of having to be the one to pull the trigger. And I'm using that term on purpose because it does mean human suffering and possible death. And what the choice for our field often has been, and that's what Sherry's showing us with what we're doing with on-call, is what that means is that we're saying we're just going to do it. We're just going to carry it on our backs. But as we're finding out since COVID, that's not working either. So we have to find a way with each other and to not be isolated and not make these kinds of choices alone, and to find a way to say like we can't do it. It's not working that advocates are doing 100 hours a month of on-call, and many of them aren't even getting paid for it, or whatever that is in your community.
Judy,
Okay.
this is so helpful, and I we could take us on a tangent because we have funding streams that mean that programs can't even make that impossible cost, but like comparison and choice that because they are funded in one stream or another, so they can't even pick from one. It's like stop their hotline hours to go into a shelter. So we can go into that tangent, but especially because it's relevant right now because we have experienced cuts. But I think that Kelly had her hand up. Is that true, Kelly? Did I let you jump in if that's
You
still
kind of answered my question. I mean,
okay?
my question was going to be, how is this message landing with your funders in Washington and what is their reaction, which I think you've kind of addressed, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say on that. And then my second thought is sort of, it's the contract that, once we sign those contracts and we agree that we're going to provide this much for this much, we're locked into that. So it seems like the procurement is the opportunity, like to say across, we can no longer make this unfair agreement that we cannot sustain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's my question, I guess.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Judy, unless you want to. Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And part of what we're leaning into, we have already, but like our next steps really leaning into is at the coalition level. I'm having conversations with the funders. In Washington State, there's two different funders, one for DD and one for SA. So talking to leadership within both of those disciplines, lifting up all of the, the elements in like what we went over here today, and then like with the intention of pushing that slippage back up, of really at that level, like what are some of the mandates are in the Washington Administrative Code. So they would require WAC changes in order for the funder to change the requirements. In another one, they're not written to WAC, they're just in there from a long dissolved entities. But over the next 6 months, what we're doing now is meeting with those funders and pushing those conversations of like, how do we get to an equal sign for programs? And again, for me, everything is embedded in choice, right? Programs have made it clear to us they don't want us to say get rid of 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
Still, some want to do that. So for us, it's really like communicating to funder, like allow for choice, that with this money, you can provide 24/7 services and or emergency shelter and or support groups and or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But allowing for the choice versus the state then mandating a whole different model that could be frankly catastrophic for programs. And then the second part, I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of the question. Was it around the human impact?
Okay. That like once we sign those contracts, right, we're sort of stuck into we've signed
Yeah.
off on, we're going to provide this much for this much. So there's this kind of opportunity in Massachusetts with the procurement. Yeah.
Yep. The efforts. I mean, I really see that it being for us at least, a coalition level like piece to take on of having a conversation with funders. Because programs, you're right. Once you've signed that contract, you need to abide by that contract, right? There's not power or ability to change at that point at the program level. So really, like for a coalition, being able to have those conversations upstream, so that ideally there can be shifts to where those contract requirements have more built-in flexibility and choice for programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're ending a 10, 11-year cycle for that contract period. So we are having some conversations, but I think this is really the prescient topic and a really, perfect timing, because we have, I think as you were speaking, it was like, yes, we've heard that anecdotally. Yes, we've heard that. And just to echo what Kelly typed in the chat, like to see the data. And I think that will be really helpful for us to say, not only is this the experience of advocates across the state, but also every year that gap between contract and services grows, right? That equal sign gets less and less equal with cost of living because we're locked into these contracts and these Chapter 257, so our rates. So I think that's really helpful to hear from you.
Another piece that I hadn't added into the slide, but I think is important just to keep in the picture, is that in that wellness survey, we asked we asked staff if they were identified as survivors. And 91% of executive directors in our direct service programs identified as survivors, and 75% of advocates who were providing direct services identify as survivors. And for me, that was really powerful of like whether coalition or a program and hopefully for funder level as well, like the work that we do is for survivors. The focus is to make the world better for survivors, and these impacts that are occurring that we've all inherited, that we've all done without like actually like seeing them for what they are, like those impacts are happening to survivors. And so like really just keeping that in as well, because we can choose to continue to do the same, like on purpose. But that part for me then changes. Like, am I going to on purpose make the same decisions when those decisions are harming survivors?
Greta, I can't see if people have their hands raised. So are there any other comments or questions or hands raised?
That's a great question. Anybody? Does anybody else have a question? I don't see any hands raised at the moment. All right.
I have a comment around our rates.
Oh,
So,
and then Elizabeth, okay, Hema?
oh, sorry. Yes. Go, Elizabeth. You go first, and then I'll comment about rates after.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to hear what you all have been doing and the really innovative thinking. I guess I'm just thinking really practically, like, are we, is Jane Doe considering basically running the same survey for Massachusetts? And did you work with a consultant, someone to like do the analysis? Did you do that yourselves? Kind of what were the tangibles? You're pointing, Judy, but I don't know to whom.
To Sherry, I think. Oh, Judy, you just muted. But
Oh, darn it. Sherry did it. And, we didn't do anything fancy. Um, Sherry's from a rural program, and, very duct tape and chicken wire. So there was no like researcher. It was just a survey, and we brought people in for a day also to we were looking for directors who frankly could stand to be in that, like we called it like the worst conversation that you'll ever have. That was kind of like the informal title of the meeting. Just people who could stand to sit in the room and both talk about math and budgets and then just the despair of this, um, and how hard it is to think about what the choices are before us. So we had about maybe 5 or 6 directors for a day, and we fed them and we talked together.
Yeah, and then the surveys went out to a much larger pool, very much more representative of programs across the state. So like there was a deep dive with a small group and then a broad capture of data. And really, like, Judy mentioned, I'm not a consultant in this kind of specialty. The focus was really to like kind of like uh the model of like keep it as simple as we possibly can in order to like just clearly like communicate and lift up like normal, abnormal, right? Like uh repeating or on purpose. And so like really trying to find like what were the through messages that people could just be like, oh yeah, I only get what I pay for. That's normal, right? And then I'm using already accepted cost points. We didn't try and create a cost value for advocacy services or a cost value for bed nights. We took ones that were already done and accepted by federal or state government already and just applied them to a service output. So it really, I mean, I guess I wouldn't have been able to make it more complicated. But my goal was really just to make it simple so that whether it's a person on the street or a person in programs or a funder, it would just be like, oh yeah, that's not normal. We can't do that. Yeah.
So, Him, if I could just jump in here for a sec, I want to suggest a couple of things. One is that all of you, as with programs around the state and Massachusetts, to really think about what is some messaging that you could come up with that you could all start to use together in your communities and test that out. Um, it's really important to get ahead of this because, just like at DV shelter, for example, when there's not enough space and somebody doesn't have a place to go, but it's time for them to go, and the participant is yelling at the staff, at the advocates, that's transfers to what this is going to be like in communities. And it's easy, especially because, advocates, by definition, the work that we're doing is like average, like it averages out, right? So if somebody doesn't have a great experience with an advocate who may be having like not the greatest day, it can be easy for the community to think it's the advocacy program that's the problem here. They are doing something wrong. And of course, all of us are human, and we can all sometimes look at our neighbors and say, like, hey, the I wish that my neighbor county program would do better. And we should get some of that money. And why are they doing that so great? and but getting the same amount of money. So it's important for us to look higher and to say what's really going on, and to do that to make that bridge for the community so that it doesn't come back bouncing back to you. Does that make sense? Okay, because we're already beginning to see some of those dynamics with blaming programs when what's happening, like survivors calling and saying, I was kicked out. I was, I had a bad experience, where we know at the coalition that's because they lost, one of our member programs lost $1 million. Um, and so that's what's happening.
Yeah, it's a
All
huge
right.
part slippage piece, right? Like not only is the way of covering the expense falling down to programs, but and then I mean any director on this call is going to know how much time does it take to write additional grants, to hold fundraisers, to solicit donations, just to cobble that together. Like imagine if that time footprint of effort could be invested into the program delivery itself, right? Like there's this whole cascade of dynamics that slippage is creating within programs that only exist because programs are having to pick up that slippage of mandates that are not being paid for.
This is so great. And Judy, I think we've all heard from funders or I've experienced a pitting of survivors against providers, even in the way that feedback is solicited. And so I think what you're saying is just really important for us to kind of hold as we think about pushing back. But Hema, sorry, thank you for pausing. You had some rate ideas, grievances to air.
That could, I don't actually, I think it's just another piece in this puzzle, and it's another contributing factor to the kind of scarcity and the tension around scarcity versus incremental increases that I think we struggle with. So in our context, our rates model does provide some incremental increases. It does not keep up by any means with the real cost of providing services. But I think that over many years, the question about whether and how and whether it even makes sense that this set of services are part of that model. There's been a little bit of a hesitation of rocking that boat because it kind of comes with a, you know, 1% cola or whatever it is. It feels promising. Anyway, all this to say, I think this is to answer Elizabeth's question about, is this something that JDI could take on? I mean, I think this is precisely where I think this kind of effort to get ahead, I love the encouragement to get ahead, and that's what we're hoping to do of this, not just this procurement process, but really all of the funding related constrictions that are going to be kind of imposed on the backs of advocates and survivor advocates in the coming years, whether it is this narrow, not so narrow, large DPH reprocurement process, whether it is navigating VOCA cuts around the corner, whether it's navigating a range of other kind of trickle down impacts of loss of SNAP benefits, loss of health care. That comprehensive view is not being tallied. And I'm really excited to get into some of that work hopefully with you all in the coming months. So let's do it if folks are game for participating in this.
Yeah, and I would just add there's so many nuances, right? And like just like having something like be brought out of abnormal to normal doesn't like make an easy fix. But what I can say of what hasn't changed over the past 50 years is that this work matters. This work has incredible life-changing impacts for survivors, and our communities need it. They need this work to continue. So like all of the pieces lifting up of how do we protect, make sure that this is available for people, and that the people that are doing the work are being honored and cared for as well. Like it's possible and so, so important.
There's a few comments in the chat that I just want to lift up. Kelly Dunn said maybe a concept like, for example, it would cost $200,000 more for us to be able to sign this contract and fulfill its requirements. And that got some applause. And then Nani said, some of what I've heard in other funding conversations is about quote unquote not paying for the value of the work. And just want to uplift that the work is specialized, it requires expertise. It's not just about paying for mandates, but the actual value of the work. And just that it's not just dollars and cents. And I agree, I think we agree. And the making it those simple messages for the community. So, some of the messaging that we're trying out in our state is these are life-saving emergency services, just like other life-saving emergency services, but there's not enough funding to actually provide those life-saving emergency services that every community is counting on. And then really spelling out, like, connect the dots for people around response to child sexual abuse, domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual abuse. And that every community is counting on that and deserves that. So what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of, part of I would say the unexpected consequence of confidentiality and privacy for survivors has been, this is where our fortress mentality can get in the way, is that it's like a black box for people about what we do. They're like, you can call them for help. They don't really know what it is, except what they see on Lifetime television, right? Or maybe like back in the day on Oprah. They have no idea that we're doing more than like, they think we go and like pick up people like, who are standing outside who've run out of their house and that somehow we help them, but they don't really want to think about it because it's scary to them. They have no idea what we do around sexual assault. They're just like, go talk to them. I don't want to think about it. And so really describing, like I'm not sure that it's like it's a bridge to get to what you're saying, Nani, about like this people deserve more. But even saying describing like emergency domestic violence services, shelter, to sexual assault response when people go to the hospital, being there for children who've been sexually abused, legal advocacy, even describing those things helps fill in those blank spaces for people. And it also helps to fill in and answer the question, can't this just be done by volunteers? Because, that's like some of the old model. And when we describe more about what the help actually is, it kind of stops that question of like, well, can't you just get more volunteers? And also, we're going to make you some quilts and bring you old clothes, and that's going to solve it.
So many quilts in our closets, Judy. Uh, yeah, and also, if you want us to have volunteers, can you please fund community engagement programming so we can train them and find them and keep them, and that's not happening. Um, uh, hat and mitten season commences. Yes, Sherry.
Yes, frozen turkeys are going to be upon us.
That's right. I have like a million more questions, including like I'm sure we can think about ways to leverage these data points for private fundraising too. So like that's kind of percolating. Like yes, it's helpful to push back against funders, but also it's great to tell the story. So lots of questions, but I want to just see if there are any other last questions from anyone else. Um, I'm trying to scan here. No. What do you think? Should we do this, y'all? Yeah? Well, I'll say thank you. I really appreciate friends, you coming all this way through time zones to be with us today, and to share your big brains and big hearts. And it just feels really validating and also like some clear path before us to kind of to show the numbers, to show what is going on here in Massachusetts. So I will say thank you. I don't know, Hema, if you have anything else to
Yeah,
add.
same. You all are brilliant. And thank you for sharing this wisdom with all of us. I actually love the simplicity of it. I think that is so needed. I think another version of our fortress mentality is sometimes we make things more complex than they
More
have
of
to
a
be.
fortress. We
More of
need,
a fortress.
yeah.
So much gratitude, and I know you all are not far away in our hearts, and we will be in close contact soon. And just thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, everybody who came and asked questions. We will share this out and share out the PowerPoint as well. Even that, so practical to have it a usable tool. And have a wonderful day, all.
You've got a great coalition. Thanks so much, and we look forward to hearing how it's going. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Sherry.